Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second installment from 3GNY for our webinar series with 3GNY, 3G New Jersey, and 3G Philly in partnership with the Maltz Museum. Jewishness, Activism, and Belonging, the post-Holocaust diaspora and intersections with marginalized communities. The goal of the series is to highlight the diverse intersections of being Jewish and being descendants of Holocaust survivors in the modern post-World War II era. My name is Lauren Engelman, and I am a proud 3G grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, my beautiful grandma Lily, who is 95 and my inspiration. Before we dive into tonight's program, I'd like to share a bit about 3GNY for those of you who may be new here and may not be familiar with us. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of survivors and our allies and supporters. As the last living link, we preserve the legacies and lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide supportive forum for descendants of survivors. I've been involved with 3GNY for many years, and my grandmother has even shared her own story with our community. And speaking of sharing stories, 3GNY has a fantastic 3G speaker program called We Do, which stands for We Educate. In this 4-week training program, grandchildren of survivors learn how to organize and compellingly share their family stories in classrooms and with companies and community groups. This school year alone, our speakers have told their family stories in over 200 classrooms and other settings, building personal connection to lessons and legacies of the Holocaust for over 7,500 students. Congrats to all of our We Do members. This impactful work would not be possible without the support of our community. A gift to 3GNY of any amount would be so very appreciated. There's a link in the chat with ways to donate. Thank you so very much. We'll be sending more information about 3GNY and We Do in a follow-up email after the event. June is Pride Month while we're all here today, and we are excited to celebrate and amplify the LGBTQIA+ community through tonight's intersectional event. I am proud to introduce Jonathan Graff, a fellow 3G, to share more about tonight's program, and Dr. Jake Newsome.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Lauren, for the intro. Before we begin, I'd like to share a brief message from our partners at the Maltz Museum in Cleveland, Ohio. We are grateful for their support in co-sponsoring our program this evening. The Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage is proud to partner on today's program and join 3GNY to create broader access to Holocaust education. Rooted in the Jewish value of respect for all humanity, the Maltz Museum exists to stop the hate. We look to history to understand our present so that we can consider how to build a more inclusive future. After all, as we often remind ourselves, history is happening now. We hope that you will join us in person or for one of our many virtual experiences that educates and inspires. Currently on view at the Maltz Museum through August is the special exhibition Chagall for Children, where kids can touch the art. We offer in-person and virtual tours, as well as a variety of programs aimed at all ages. Learn more about all we have to offer on our website, www.maltzmuseum.org. Thank you, Dr. Newsome, for joining us tonight. Thank you again to 3GNY for allowing us to partner with you on tonight's program. A little bit about myself. I'm the descendant of 3 survivors, all originally from different towns in Poland. Fun fact, during the war, my paternal grandparents met as refugees in a Soviet labor camp or a kolkhoz in Uzbekistan. Savta said the locals could not communicate with the refugees, but in time, they did find a commonality. Savta said she found out that the Uzbekis also do circumcisions on newborn boys. That's the commonality, you may laugh. A little bit about myself. I came out of the closet as a teenager on Staten Island over 20 years ago. I'd like to thank 3GNY for inviting me to be a part of this event and to have the honor of introducing Dr. Jake Newsome. Dr. Newsome is an award-winning scholar of German and American LGBTQ+ history, whose research and resources educate global audiences. His forthcoming book, Pink Triangle Legacies, Coming Out in the Shadow of the Holocaust, published by Cornell University Press, traces the transformation of the pink triangle from a concentration camp badge in Nazi Germany into a symbol of queer activism, pride, and community. He'll be sharing a sneak peek of information from his book with us this evening. In addition to serving as a historical advisor for projects, film projects, podcasts, and plays, Dr. Newsome has been invited by the French, UK, and US governments to speak about the important lessons that LGBTQ plus history has for all of us today. He now works as a museum professional in Washington, DC. Thank you. Now, Jake, it's yours.
All right, well, thanks. Thanks for that, Jonathan. Welcome to everyone who is logging on from wherever you are across the country. It's one of the great silver linings of this pandemic is that we've learned how to gather in digital spaces and not be limited by our physical locality. So I'm happy to be here in this digital space with all of you. First, I want to say thanks to 3GNY for the invitation to come speak with all of you. Personally, thanks to Dave and Lauren for putting this event together. We've met, we've hashed it all out, planned it all out. So I really appreciate the hospitality and the effort to support this important history. I would also like to say thanks to all the co-sponsors who helped make tonight's event possible. It really is an honor for me to be invited to speak to all of you by an organization, or really a collective of organizations that are dedicated to preserving memory, right? To enshrining and protecting history. And in a way, Pride Month, LGBTQ Pride Month, which is celebrated in June each year as a way to commemorate the queer uprising against police brutality at the Stonewall Inn in New York City that happened back in 1969. And so each year in Pride Month, we commemorate that history in a similar way as Holocaust history is also commemorated, in that, yes, we want to keep the memory alive and also pay tribute to those who did not survive. So as both a gay man and as a Holocaust scholar myself, I'm committed to keeping both of these histories alive as much as possible. And as we'll see tonight, those two histories aren't always separate. They intertwine quite a bit. So tonight I would like to share, well, speaking of sharing, I should go ahead and share my screen. And I would like tonight to share some stories from my new book that really showcase the danger of silencing voices and silencing histories, but also the inherent power that there is in reclaiming a history for oneself and essentially saving it from the closet. So tonight I want to start by telling the story of a man named Richard Gruna, who you see here on your screen. Richard was born in the fall of 1903 in a small German town nestled along the northern border. He was one of 8 children. They lived a relatively comfortable middle-class life. And in fact, Richard wanted to become an artist. So he went to art school and he had plans to make it as an artist. Unfortunately, those didn't work out. But Richard also knew from an early age that he was gay. His family knew that he was gay, and they all knew that it was going to be impossible for him to live openly as such in the small conservative hometown. And so he decided to move to Berlin, which during that time, this was during what was known as the Weimar Republic, which was Germany's first democratic form of government. This was installed after Germany lost World War I. And especially in large urban centers like the capital city of Berlin, witnessed an incredible blossoming of LGBTQ culture. Everything from nightclubs and bars and cafes to shops and restaurants to political organizations organized by the queer community themselves. And so this is what drew Richard Gruna from his hometown of Flensburg to the capital city in February of 1933. So if you know your timeline, that was not necessarily a great time to be moving to the capital city of Germany. Now, even though there was an unprecedented level of tolerance, I wouldn't call it a full acceptance, but perhaps greater tolerance for the LGBTQ community in the big city centers like Berlin, Germany did have a wide range of laws on the books that were meant to govern its citizens' morality. And one of those was called Paragraph 175, which was Germany's really notorious anti-gay law. It had been on the books since the unification of Germany in 1871, and you can see the text of it here on your screen. It criminalized unnatural indecency between men. And I will say here that the word men is not the generic, mankind. It actually only applied to men. And essentially the lawmakers at the time believed that women really couldn't be lesbian or gay, and that even if they engaged in same-sex relationships with each other, once the right man came along, they would essentially fall in line and become straight again. And so the law applied only to men. Now, while the Berlin Police Department began relaxing its enforcement of Paragraph 175 in the city, really the rest of the country began ramping up their enforcement of the law, even during the Weimar Republic, as a way to essentially fight back against what they saw as the moral decline of the big urban capital. So actually during the Weimar Republic, the number of arrests under Paragraph 175 actually rises across the country. So when the Nazis come to power early in 1933, one of their campaign promises is that they are going to restore German values, which included protecting the German youth from the so-called homosexual lifestyle. So after they've been in power for a couple of years, in 1935, they decide to amend Paragraph 175 because they believe that the way that it was worded originally placed too many legal roadblocks on them. And so they wanted to be able to use it however and whenever they wanted. So in 1935, they amend it. And so you might ask, what was it about the LGBTQ community that Nazis found so dangerous that they would have to, they already inherited a national anti-gay law, and now they're amending it. So what is it? Why did they consider this community so dangerous? The first really was the Nazis believed LGBTQ folks posed a threat to the so-called master race. The Nazis believed that queer folks robbed children from the fatherland and therefore actually posed a reproductive risk to the future of the master race. Second, they believed that the so-called homosexual lifestyle posed a threat to the social order by inverting the traditional gender norms. So it supposedly made men weak and effeminate, while at the same time turning women incredibly masculine, and therefore giving up their nurturing motherly duties to raise children for the nation. And this next reason is not unique to the Nazis, but the Nazis believed that because men had access to positions of authority, whether it was in politics or the economy or the military, the Nazis viewed gay or queer men as the most dangerous threat out of all the folks in the LGBTQ community. And I will just point out that the Nazis did kind of lump gay men, bi men, and even trans women under the kind of umbrella label of homosexual. So they didn't quite make the distinctions between some of the identities that we recognize today. And the last thing that I think is important to realize to understand how the Nazis viewed and treated the queer community is the Nazis did not believe that people were born gay or born queer. They believed that, again, that it was a lifestyle, like a vice that anyone could be tempted into. And therefore, that's actually what made it so dangerous in their mind, is that it could, slowly tempt anyone or everyone into the lifestyle. And so they really committed their efforts to confronting what they saw as the threat of homosexuality. Now, because the Nazis did not view people as being gay, but rather doing gay things, their policies never evolved into policies of genocide or to trying to kill every single gay person. But I do want to emphasize that their view of the master race of the New Germany was one in which there was absolutely no place for LGBTQ folks at all. So while they focused their efforts on very violently eradicating LGBTQ spaces, all of these bars and meeting places and publications that I mentioned earlier, so while they were attacking those things, we have to keep in mind that it was queer people themselves who bore the brunt of all of that violence. Now, the Nazis used many tools to persecute the LGBTQ community, but one of the things that I did want to point out is that denunciations by gay people's neighbors, their co-workers, their bosses, their landlords, turning them into the Nazis was an incredibly, absolutely vital part of the Nazi state's ability to be able to identify and then prosecute and persecute the LGBTQ community. This is actually what happened to Richard Grune, who we met at the beginning of the story. He moved, as I said, to Berlin in February of 1933, so just weeks after Hitler had been named chancellor. Because all of the gay meeting places had been closed down, gay folks had to end up meeting in private spaces. And so Richard was lucky he owned an apartment. So he hosted a series of parties in the fall of 1934 for a lot of his gay and lesbian friends. Unfortunately, one of those attendees spent the party noting the names and addresses and professions of everyone there. And we don't know anything about her motivations, but we know that she went to the Gestapo and turned in a long list of queer people to the Nazis. And so by Christmas of 1934, Richard Grune and 70 other men were arrested under paragraph 175. Now, unfortunately, this was not an isolated event. The statistics from the archive show that about 1/3 of all paragraph 175 cases that made it to court and were ended in convictions stemmed from civilian denunciations. So in total, over the course of the Nazi regime, the Nazis arrested about 100,000 queer men under paragraph 175. And there are, I would say, probably just as many other queer people arrested under a number of different laws that wasn't necessarily specific as paragraph 175. Anywhere between 7,000 to 10,000 so-called repeat offenders were sent, whether after they just finished their time in prison, or sometimes they didn't even face a trial and didn't go to normal prison at all, but were sent straight to concentration camps. Richard Grune was one of those, not because he had been arrested more than once, but because the Nazis believed since he had hosted a party that drew so many men and women, that he was a particular threat to public safety because he had corrupted so many people into the homosexual lifestyle. Now, as all prisoners who were brought into concentration camps were labeled with a colored marking that denoted why they were in the concentration camps. And eventually, the predominant symbol marking gay prisoners was the pink triangle. So here you see Richard Grune's internment card for the camp of Flossenburg. This Richard, after being arrested in 1934, spent the rest of the Nazi regime in a series of different prisons and camps. That means he spent over a decade imprisoned, whether it was in a quote unquote normal prison or in a concentration camp. So he was in Flossenburg at the time of liberation in the spring of 1945. And as the Nazis were trying to evacuate the camp to flee from the impending army, Richard was actually able to escape. And he made his way home back to Flensburg, where he reunited with his sister. And unfortunately, I guess very fortunately for Richard, he was actually the exception to the rule, because we know estimates show that anywhere between 60 to 65% of concentration camp prisoners who were imprisoned because they were gay died while they were in the camps. Now, in May of 1945, the Allied liberators had to decide what to do with the hundreds of thousands of concentration camp survivors that were now in their care. And their policy was that all of the prisoners who had been incarcerated based on racial, political, or religious grounds were to be immediately released back into occupied Germany. But the policy for so-called common criminals was that they were to remain imprisoned. And because the gay men, the men with the pink triangle, had broken a national law, right, paragraph 175, the Allies considered them to be common criminals. So concentration camp inmates, gay inmates who had just survived the Holocaust, and if they still had time left to serve on their prison sentence, the Allies transferred them from these liberated concentration camps and put them straight in a nearby prison, where many of them were forced to serve out the rest of their term, which in some cases was multiple years. On top of that, I think what, at least for me, quite surprising chapter of history, a couple of years later in 1949, when East and West Germany were created as new nations, both new nations decided to keep the particularly Nazi version of paragraph 175 and write it into their criminal code. So West Germany in particular, which is what I have studied, not only kept the Nazi version of the law, they upheld it multiple times in court. And despite the fact that there were multiple challenges to the constitutionality of using a Nazi law in a new democratic nation that was supposedly based on the civil liberties and rights of individuals. But as I said, West Germany decided to keep the law and enforce it. And over the course, at least the first 2 decades of West Germany's existence, they arrested 100,000 gay men. So the same number that the Nazi regime arrested during its 12-year reign. Now, an arrest under paragraph 175 in West Germany, of course, there were no more concentration camps, but you still could have your government identification card revoked. You could have your education degrees taken away. You could be kicked out of any number of organizations. You could be evicted from your housing and fired from your job. All of that, of course, on top of facing the social taboo and the social ostracization that came with being outed as gay in this early period. Many of these gay survivors did decide to break the silence and tell their stories as they sought to gain compensation or reparations as victims of Nazi injustice. But they were all summarily denied any form of compensation or recognition as a victim of Nazi injustice. And in fact, you have to imagine the incredible bravery that it took for these gay men to break the silence, because as you see, paragraph 175 was still in effect. So they would have to be admitting to acts that were still considered illegal at the time. So all of this created essentially a metaphorical closet in which gay men had to keep not only their current sexuality a secret, but they had to keep their memories a secret as well. And so it led to this, I would say, mirage of silence about what happened to the LGBTQ community during the Holocaust. Because on the one hand, silence can be a noun, right? The absence of sound or the absence of noise, but silence can also be a verb, right? And what we see here is the West German government and society very actively silencing the LGBTQ community, keeping them out of the history books and the broader dialogue of the Holocaust that was taking place in West German society at the time. Now, in 1969, paragraph 175 was amended. And essentially, it wasn't taken all the way off the books, but it was amended to essentially say that it was okay to be gay as long as you were over the age of 21. This cleared the way for the emergence of a political organized gay rights movement in West Germany at the time. And so beginning in the late 60s, early 70s, gay liberation activists wanted to mobilize queer Germans across the country into action. And during this period, not just in Germany, also in the United States, the act of coming out was an incredibly important, not just a personal decision, but also a political decision. It was seen, when I say coming out, in case there's anyone who doesn't know, right, coming out is publicly claiming a queer identity. And so the thought was that coming out was a sort of personal liberation, but it was also a necessary first step in beginning to dismantle the homophobia against the community in the broader society. So they decided that one way of initiating this personal and very public coming out was for gay activists to wear a gay symbol. And of course, this opened up all kinds of conversations about what does that even mean? What is a gay symbol? What would it look like? What would it refer to? What would the symbolism be? And there was, as you might imagine, a lot of discussion. But in 1972, there was a book that was published under the pseudonym of Heinz Hager. It was the very first book written by a gay concentration camp survivor. And its title was quite simple. It was The Men with the Pink Triangle. And suddenly the gay activists had their answer. And so only a couple of months later, a gay leftist organization in Frankfurt called Rot Schwul used the pink triangle as a symbol of gay activism for the very first time. Others throughout West Germany soon followed suit, like the HAW, or Homosexuelle Aktion West-Berlin, quite a mouthful. It was one of the earliest and eventually largest and most influential of the gay rights groups in West Germany. Saw this idea of taking the pink triangle as a gay rights logo as something that would declare to West German society that being gay was not something that they should be ashamed of. And in fact, they were going to reclaim the pink triangle, and in doing so, take the power away from anyone who would try to use it to label them as degenerate. Peter Heidenstrom, who you see here, was one of the founding members of the HAW and was there at the vote to adopt the pink triangle, told me several years ago in an interview that the pink triangle very specifically was a perfect image for the new gay rights movement, especially in Germany, because number one, West Germans would instantly recognize it as a concentration camp badge. And therefore, it was very specifically a historical warning about what happens when homophobia is left unchecked. Peter also mentioned that the pink triangle posed a rhetorical question, a very pointed question to West German society, which was, had Germany really confronted its Nazi demons? So this story, the reclamation of the pink triangle, started out in West Germany, but it didn't stay there for very long. Only a couple of months later, a group of gay activists in New York City who had personally been traveling back and forth to West Germany and were actually taking part in some of those early meetings in West Berlin, decided that they would reclaim the pink triangle here on this side of the Atlantic. So in August of 1974, led by David Thorstad and John Lauritsen, activists in the Gay Activist Alliance, used the pink triangle in the United States for the very first time as a gay rights logo. From there, it spread across the country, right? This symbol began to mobilize all facets of the LGBTQ community. So not just gay men, but also lesbians, transgender activists, bisexual activists across the community, mobilizing them into action. But the symbol also, worked as a unifier. It became a tool or a weapon a lot of times against political opponents who were trying to keep LGBTQ rights, from proceeding, but also as a way to build bridges between different communities. So, for example, in Miami, against the fight against the really wretched Anita Bryant, the pink triangle was used as a way to try to build solidarity among gay and Jewish communities, since both not only faced persecution during the Holocaust, but also continued to face discrimination in the present. And one of the things I find so interesting is that Americans so quickly and easily adopted this chapter of German history as their own. And this, I think, helps indicates, right, that there was this establishment of a new gay identity that transcended national boundaries. It didn't matter what national, origins you had, but because you were gay, you were able to tap in to this global gay past or gay history. And so that is this symbol not only connected people to the past, but connected them to each other across national boundaries. Now, gay activists also saw the power of taking ownership of a symbol that was once used to dehumanize people. And so here you see a really, I think, gritty but wonderful quote by Martha Shelley, who was a pioneer. She was Jewish. She was in the lesbian feminist movement and a co-founder of the Gay Liberation Front. So when I talked to her last year, this was one of my interviews that I was most excited about. And then it really only lasted about 3 minutes. She said what she had to say and then she was done. But she talked about how she liked the pink triangle because it was reclaiming this thing as a badge of pride rather than shame. And it was a way of giving the middle finger to the Nazis, right? Letting them know that they had not won. So by the 1980s, the pink triangle had become the most widely used and widely recognizable symbol of queer rights in North America and across Europe. And really it resonated with queer people from various backgrounds, sexualities, gender identities, and all the different types of intersecting identities. But it was in 1986 when a group of 6 artists and activists in New York City designed what is now the very iconic Silence Equals Death poster in the middle of, or at least at the beginning of the AIDS crisis. The pink triangle was catapulted into the public consciousness. The following year, so in 1987, a group that became known as ACT UP adopted the poster, and it really spread from there and became a symbol of AIDS activism, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. Now, the pink triangle, I've focused a lot on its political use, but it wasn't just for politics. It helped people make sense of themselves and their place in society, but also their place in history. So here you can see a poster, a lovely handmade poster of an organization that was called Triangulo Rosa, which was a gay Latino organization that was founded here in Washington, D.C. in the 1990s. This organization provided all kinds of counseling and services for Latino gay men in the capital area. And the founder of the organization told me that we did a lot of learning from each other about the different ways to be both gay and Latino. But as different as we were, the Triangulo Rosa brought us all together. So here is actually the founder of that group, Jose Gutierrez, and he talked about why he chose the pink triangle, the Spanish version of the pink triangle, over any other symbol or name for this group. And it was he wanted to honor the history. Again, he had no connection to Jewish history, to Holocaust history, but because he was gay, he saw the pink triangle as plugging him into this new global history. Here, Black queer writer, friend, activist, and mom Cheryl Head also talked about the importance of and the power of history behind the symbol. She told me that she remembered the very first time that she saw the pink triangle in the context of gay activism was that ACT UP poster. She said, by the late 80s, you saw it everywhere. But she also said that for her, the ACT UP poster would not have been as powerful if it hadn't been for a trip to Yad Vashem that she had taken earlier in the 1980s, where she learned the history behind the pink triangle and its tie to the Holocaust. And one of the people that I think most clearly articulated what the pink triangle did in terms of tying themselves to the gay community, but also to history, is Mark Siegel, who was both gay and Jewish. He was there at the Stonewall Uprising in New York City in 1969. He said that as he came out, the pink triangle powerfully bound together his dual identities as being both gay and Jewish. But he talked about how the pink triangle was able to give roots to this new identity that was coming from the activism in the 1970s, was able to give this identity roots and legitimacy and a sense of place in history. And so knowing that history would not have been possible without the painstaking work of grassroots scholars and there's way too many for me to show and to thank here on this one particular slide. But this was a group of international scholars who were mostly queer themselves, and that continued to face incredible discrimination in their profession. And in fact, most had to find work outside of the historical profession and spend their nights and weekends in the archives to uncover and then write this history. But a lack of historical scholarship, let me send my next slide up. A lack of historical scholarship led to a boom of fiction about this past, as queer people sought to, in this, because there was a hole in the historical scholarship, they decided to write their own history using any type of art or medium that they knew. And so this was a way, through using scholarship, through using fiction as a way to acknowledge and write a past and stake a claim that we as the queer community have always been here. Now, I want to wrap up tonight by focusing on another symbol, not the pink triangle. In 1978, a San Francisco-based artist named Gilbert Baker said that he wanted a new symbol for the gay community, not the pink triangle. And he said he wanted something with soul, something that was joyful. So he designed what came to be the very first rainbow flag for the San Francisco Pride Parade in 1978. It was primarily a West Coast symbol until the New York Heritage of Pride Parade in 1985 adopted it as their symbol. And really at that point, the rainbow flag took off and slowly began to be the new symbol of the LGBTQ community. At the same time, the pink triangle began to, people began to forget its historical connection. And so as the connection to history was forgotten, it became essentially relegated to queer pop culture or even queer marketing. Now, I will say first and foremost, I like the rainbow. I like the symbolism of diversity and inclusion. I have one flying outside of my house, but the rainbow flag today has become ubiquitous, right? It is everywhere, especially during June, when all of these big corporations change their logos and use the rainbow flag. I think that by this point in time, the rainbow, despite whatever it was meant to do originally, has been tamed, right? It's been depoliticized to be made more palatable to the mainstream society. As I said, it's used to sell products and make money. But those of us in the LGBTQ community might find ourselves wondering where those big companies who have rainbow logos are when state governments are seeking to dismantle gay rights in the present. So we have been facing a renewed attack on LGBTQ rights in the past couple of years, especially since, well, the Human Rights Campaign released a report that 2021 was the worst year on record for LGBTQ legislation. And unfortunately, we're only 6 months into 2022, but we've already broken that record. You're right, different forces are trying to ban even the reading about or the teaching about the LGBTQ community. And so I would argue that as we are here in Pride Month, awash in rainbows, we actually need the pink triangle back more than ever. If we are to truly honor the memory of those who originally wore the pink triangle, we have to commit to action and justice. Words aren't enough. We have every right, as the LGBTQ community, we have every right to see ourselves represented in curriculum and history and all of the different ways that we speak about the world. I believe that all of us here, have the right to be here. This is our country as well, and we need to fight for it. because the history of the pink triangle teaches us what happens if we don't. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Newsome. I guess we're going to start with our Q&A portion of the evening, and we have some great questions that have come in from our audience. You guys can see the slide that Dr. Newsome just put up with some more information to follow up, learn some more about all the stuff he talked about. All right. There seems to be a theme with these Q&A incoming messages about the pink triangle symbolism. And I think if I kind of consolidate the questions, we can get a whole bunch of things answered instead of doing one at a time, or like feeling like people are ignored. I don't know, but we're going to try this out. So one question is regarding the ACT UP poster and how the pink triangle is like an opposite direction. It's like upside down, and if that has any particular significance. And then there's another question about the usage of the Star of David and anti-vaxxers kind of using that, and that obviously being incredibly negative, and the Jewish community frowning upon that in general, versus how the gay community has embraced the pink triangle. The gay community doesn't really see that as a negative thing. So maybe you can touch upon these questions about the symbolism.
Sure. So first to the question about the ACT UP triangle. Yeah, so that was in 1987. And as you saw on the poster, right, the future triangle is pointing upwards. And there was a lot of question about, whether that meant, what symbolism was behind that. And it actually turns out that this was one of the serendipitous, accidental events of history. I was able to interview the members of ACT UP about their designing of that poster. And they talked about, they had assigned one of their members to go do the research on which way the triangles faced originally in the concentration camps, because they wanted to pay tribute to the original symbol. They printed the posters, they plastered them all over New York City, and apparently they got some pushback from some people who said they wouldn't hang it up in their store. I believe one in particular that stood out is the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop. He said, nope, that is inaccurate, historically inaccurate. That's not the way that the pink triangle faced. And it turns out that the guy who was supposed to do the research didn't do it. And so they all got together and said, well, we just spent all of our budget printing thousands of these. What are we going to do? Are we going to reprint them? Or someone said, you know what, let's just own it. Let's tell people that it was intentional, that we did it as a way to be uplifting and empowering. And then that's the story that stuck. But none of the original designers tried to hide it, right? They were quite open that it was an accident, but it was an accident that led to something empowering. So sometimes history is full of accidents that have large repercussions. So yeah, now to the other question of is it always a good thing? Is it ever a good thing to reclaim symbols from a traumatic past like the Holocaust? And even with the pink triangle, there was actually a lot of pushback or there was some pushback, I will say, on using the pink triangle, but it mostly came from the argument that if they used the pink triangle, it would forever tie being gay to being a victim, because you could not erase, even though if you could reclaim the pink triangle, you could not erase its original meaning. So there were some folks like Gilbert Baker who said, we need to have our own symbol that we don't even have to reclaim, but it's just originally ours. So I guess, so that would be one bit of resistance to the pink triangle. You mentioned, or the question mentioned, today anti-vaxxers using the yellow Star of David. I think that this clearly, I think that is incredibly offensive to the memory of everyone who suffered during the Holocaust. I think it speaks to the multivalent nature of symbolism. And so Just as you can reclaim a symbol and use it for something positive, like community building, like activism, it can also be used in very negative ways. And so I think that as long as it is done with respect and in conjunction with the community that it affects, there are productive ways forward. And I will say that I asked all of my interviewees about resistance, and most of the folks, actually all the folks that I interviewed, said, well, we always asked our gay Jewish colleagues what they felt about us using this symbol, and we would take their lead, and if they said it was not okay, we would not use it. But actually, a lot of the folks that I spoke to were also Jewish. You know, they were gay and Jewish, and they saw it as something empowering. Even I think 4 out of the 6 members of the Silence Equals Death collective were also Jewish as well. So there was, this is a gay and Jewish story as well.
Wow, so powerful. Thank you. Oh my God, we have so many, firstly, we have so many great comments here. Thanking you, Dr. Newsome, for your presentation. Let's see, we have so many great questions here. This is really interesting from Marcy. I'm really interested to hear your take on it. She said, thank you, a great presentation. Can you please share the impact of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld in the 1930s and on the world today? Also, please say more about the labeling of lesbians and queer women in the camps.
Perfect. So for those who might not be familiar with Hirschfeld, he was a German sexologist. So he was a researcher of human sexuality in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He was really a pioneer in arguing for social and legal tolerance of the LGBTQ community. He argued that folks were born along what he called a spectrum of sexual intermediaries. And so therefore, being straight was just as natural as being gay or anywhere else on this spectrum. So he argued that because someone was born gay, that meant it was quite immoral and should be illegal to discriminate against them for something they couldn't change. And so he founded the world's first gay rights organization. He campaigned against paragraph 175. He started what was called the Institute for Sexual Science, which provided a library, exhibit space, counseling, healthcare for the queer community. His staff rather was particularly pioneering in gender affirmation surgery and gender affirmation services. So folks came to Berlin to see Hirschfeld and his staff, not just from across Germany, but literally from all across Europe and North America and Asia. And he really helped make Berlin become the gay capital of the world. Then the Nazis came to power, right? And as a gay, Jewish, and socialist man, Hirschfeld was, incredibly targeted by the Nazis. We're all familiar with the famous book burnings, but at least what was new to me recently was that Hirschfeld's Institute was a primary target of that book burning. And so over 20,000 books and articles and rare artifacts were taken from his institute and burned in the bonfires that evening in May of 1933. So I think that sometimes we think the further you go back into history, the worse things must be for folks like the LGBTQ community, but that's not always the case. The community had built quite a vibrant life for itself before it was destroyed actually quite quickly by not only the Nazis, but the ordinary Germans as well. So then the other part of the question was about the experiences of queer women. And as I said, paragraph 175 didn't apply to women, but the Nazis did use a web of other laws and policies to arrest women who did not conform to their idea of the perfect German mother and wife. And mother was the important thing. They wanted their so-called Aryan women to be having lots of Aryan children. And so women like lesbians or other queer women who didn't fit to that were a lot of times arrested under simply public indecency laws or vagrancy laws. And a lot of them, not as many lesbians were sent to camps, to the concentration camps as gay men. They a lot of times just spent time, I don't want to say just, they were sent to prisons. But then there were a number of lesbians who were sent to camps. They didn't have a specific label like gay men did, but a lot of the lesbians were identified with the Black Triangle, right, which was the badge for so-called antisocials or social degenerates. And so this was kind of an umbrella term for anyone who existed outside the Nazis' understanding of what it meant to be in the master race. So the Black Triangle wasn't only for lesbians, but it was forced on to many lesbians who were sent to the camps. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I mean, the results of your research are incredible. The amount of detail you're able to provide these very specific stories. So, more about the symbolism. I remember like 15 years ago, I was in a small town in Italy during one of these 1 week vacations you could take off of work. And there were like rainbow flags all over the street. And 15 years ago, if you saw a rainbow flag, it'd be on Christopher Street or in front of a gay coffee shop or something, only during Pride Month and only in these neighborhoods. It was not everywhere. So 15 years ago, Italy, I'm like, wow, I thought Catholic Italy, like so conservative. I can't believe it. There, wow, Europe, so great. And then I learned that in Europe, at least at that time, the rainbow flag was the flag for peace. And it was really, it was like meant to be a stand against the Iraq war.
Oh, wow.
And some of the rainbow flags said PACE, pace, in Italian on them, which was, not all of them did. But I'd like to think if they all did, then I would have known. But I was like, wow, Italy is so gay. Who knew? So it is not. We have a question. We have a question about the movie that led to the story of the musical Cabaret, the film I Am a Camera, I guess about life during the Weimar Republic. And the question is just, how accurate is that?
So it was kind of loosely autobiographical from Christopher Isherwood, and then was kind of adapted, and some of the details might have been a little embellished. Now, I will say, I'm not in terms of historical accuracy, it's a great story, but accurate, I would not use it as a documentary. Because I do think that it tends to, even including all of the subsequent editions, whether it was movies or plays, usually run the tension or run the risk of almost portraying Nazi and Nazism as sexually perverse. And because they are perverse, that there's somehow this connection between being queer and being fascist, right? Because all of these, you see in Cabaret, all of the men in their uniforms, and they're showing up and they're supposed to be engaging in all this depravity. And it doesn't quite get into the fact that the Nazis were also waging this incredibly violent campaign against the very people that were supposedly there at the Cabaret. So again, it is a story. It has its purpose in terms of telling some semblance of historical, or sorry, some form of truth. But I would view it with a grain of salt.
I love that. We are getting close to time. I think maybe we have time for one or maybe two more questions, and we can close things out and make sure that you all have resources to go get Jake's book and look at his website. This is a really interesting question from Daniel. Thank you for an extraordinary presentation, Dr. Newsome. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on the intersection of LGBTQ and disability advocacy communities.
Oh, that is really, that's a great question. And I think that intersectionality is something that we don't do enough of, whether it's with the disability movement or any other form of identity. It very rarely, I think, makes it out of the ivory tower. We like to write about it and talk about it, But I think that, to be LGBT issues are disability issues, right? And are racial justice issues, because LGBTQ folks have different varying levels of abilities or different racial identities. And so I think that the queer rights movement, and I use the term to kind of encompass all the way back from the 60s up to the present, has had a very, I would say, tumultuous and problematic relationship with the disability rights movement. I think that the main kind of stars of the gay rights movement have a lot of times been able-bodied, cisgendered, white gay men. And so I think that there's been progress made in the past, especially the past few years, where we're trying to, really deconstruct some of these levels of privilege that exist even within a marginalized community, because within it, right, there are different levels of access to privilege and power. And so I think that there is a lot more to be done on uplifting and exploring those intersections of queer identity, queer activism, and disability activism as well. So I appreciate you raising that issue here at the end, so that we'll all be thinking about it as we sign off for the night.
Awesome. Thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone. In the chat, you can find Jake's email if anyone wants to pose any burning questions. You can also go to his website. Also, there is a special offer this evening with Jake's book coming out. Lastly, thank you all for attending tonight's program. I learned so much, like mind blown so much from Dr. Newsome. So thank you, Dr. Newsome. It's been such a pleasure to work with you. I can't wait to read your book. You can find additional resources on this topic at wjakenewsome.com/resources. The link shared in the chat will also be shared out with the recording this week. Have a great evening and happy Pride Month.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.
Bye.